Sabtu kita jangan lupa untuk belajar lagi ya guys ya, belajar HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so on untuk semester 3 berikutnya dan seterusnya ya untuk kerja nanti. Benar. Let's see, kita siapin dulu. Ini aku pengen lihat labku dulu bentar. Tapi enaknya kalau kasih lagu gitu bagus nggak sih? Soalnya kalau terdengar bingung tuh mana ya? PGM-nya, kasih PGM nggak sih? Atau study with lah. Oke, tadi sempat buffering, don't know why. Bagus sih suaranya, boleh. Oke, kita lanjut ya. Tadi kita udah belajar sampai HTML, sekarang masuk ke yang bagian HTML. Tapi sebelumnya, a quick recap ya, yang udah dipelajarin sebelumnya. Jadi aku buka depanku. Jadi yang pertama ini ada namanya HTML, like HTML itself, the World Wide Web, Internet, create data from point A to B. Internet data talk to each other. Internet works set on computers that somehow communicate. Lalu ada routers, computers, servers untuk route informasi dari satu titik ke titik lain. Berbeda dengan perangkat elektronik pada umumnya, dia tinggal di data centers, a big warehouse, and they use software to figure out the route to figure that out. Dan software that they use are TCP and IP. These are the language or two protocols combined. Nah, alasannya ini adalah untuk si router itu dia untuk bisa membuat decisions. Okay? And also it is called IP or Internet Protocol. Dimana dia fokus di alamat sebuah server. Dimana tiap elektronik itu punya a unique identifier for their own self. So like this, they have something like for hashtag. Mana setiap hashtag ini tuh dari 0 hingga 255. Dimana dengan 4 kombinasi ini kita akan punya 4 billion. 4 billion itu 4 miliar ya. 4 miliar kemungkinan. Dimana ini adalah versi keempat. Tapi karena meningkatnya digitnya mulai beredar sekarang, maka diperlukannya versi ke-6, dimana akan ada 6 kombinasi untuk meningkatkan kemungkinannya, menyesuaikan dengan kebutuhan market. Nah, TCP sendiri itu agar tahu urutan dan atau jumlah pecahan informasi. Oke, apa tadi? Lalu ada defined ports, itu adalah unique numeric identifier for a specific internet service. 80 itu HTTP, 443 itu HTTPS, 25 email, 43 DNS, and so on. Recipients adalah penerima. A server can handle multiple type of service ports, which we call them uniplex, which time service should be handling this inbound request. Agar tahu which type of service should be handling this inbound request. Oke, lalu HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, itu to govern how web browsers and web servers intercommunicate. HTTPS, the secure version, encryption, and scrambled data. Jadi aku dan hanya aku yang bisa akses itu tanpa bisa diintip oleh orang ketiga. Okay? URLs, uniform resource locators, the address used to get info from the internet or the World Wide Web. Example like di mana example.com are the domain name and www.example.com is the host name, the name of specific server, collection of servers ranging from 20 to 20,000 and so on. And lastly, there's called like .com. This is a TLD of top level domain. What type of domain it is? .com mean commercial, .gov mean government, .org mean organization, and so on. Inside of this envelope, get, it would get me a specific web page. Yes, but it is general. And there's also a case called post, send info someone else, often sensitive and personal data. It's called curl, is to connect URL, curl dash capital I, and then the full URL. Yeah, okay. I mean, it doesn't really, yeah, abbreviate, vernacular, acclimated, esoteric. Oh yeah, aku lupa ada DNS, Domain Name System Server. Yes. Typically live inside of your internet service provider's network or university campus or company's office. Convert domain names into IP address. Jika satu DNS bisa, ini dia tanya ke temannya yang lain ya di root DNS server jika tidak sampai dia tahu. Jika tidak tahu, konteks aku sewa domain hosting request to add an entry. Ada dikasih sebagai alias dari domainku. Mau gadget kita ada sistem autosave IP address page called it. Jika mau pindah remote webmu, itu akan merubah the old IP address. The problem is it will be not irrelevant anymore. Luckily, dalam DNS server ada namanya expiration dates. Setelah the domain is called, bisa expire within seconds, minutes, hours, days. Tapi expire sampai tahunan, a year, it will be unguaranteed for your website. DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, it gives your computers an IP address when it boots up. Dynamically figure out what's their IP address. Langsung gitu otomatis. Govern how your device get its IP address. It also tells you your computer what DNS server to use. Give you IP address one or more DNS servers to ask question of. Also tell the IP address of your default gateway, the router that you should use by default to handle one of those envelopes. Okay, that's a quick recap what's going to be happening. So yeah, let's start and continue our session.
Web pages are.
Tapi jangan lupa kita lihat ini dulu ya guys ya. Oke, halo, selamat pagi, selamat datang. Ini belajar session ya, aku belajar HTML buat semester depan kampus. Good luck. Okay. See you there. Happy see you there.
All right, this is CS50, and this week we begin.
HTML ya. Tadi itu satu squad yang dipelajarin ya, oke?
All right, we're back, and we now focus on HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, which is the language in which web pages are written. It is not a programming language, and as such, we won't need to spend all that much time on it because the basics of HTML are fairly straightforward, even though it has a decently large vocabulary, different features that you'll pick up invariably over time. What HTML does have fundamentally are what are called tags and attributes. These are the basic building blocks of the language.
Oke, tadi sebenarnya pengen ku hapus dulu ya ini. Kita nggak belajar HTML anjir masih like the konsep dasar like how particular things go, like how internet and how information set up on the internet. Baru kita belajar ininya ya. Lagi di HTML-nya. HTML. Nah, HTML ini consists of tags and attributes. Tags and attributes. That. Nah.
And what fundamentally are what are called tags and attributes. These are the basic building blocks of the language. And what the language looks like is this. So here is perhaps the simplest web page that I could come up with, a hello world web page, if you will.
Yeah, like it. And top type HTML. Ini kayaknya sebenarnya ada ya. Kalau ada HTML language, English, pasti ada head, body, footer ada optional tapi itu di depan ada ininya ya. Oke, title, hello title, hello body.
And it's just text. It is text that's typically stored in a file, like index.html for short. And in that file would just be these lines of code. And these lines here are going to indicate to the browser what it should do upon receipt of an envelope containing this message. Now, how are we going to go about serving up this content? Well, ultimately, we just need to put this content on an actual web server. Well, it turns out you already have a web server, even though you haven't been using it as such. In other words, when you visit cs50.dev and use VS Code in the cloud, you're obviously using a browser, but you're less obviously using a web server that is serving up a copy of VS Code to you in that browser. But the caveat there is that by default, you've probably been in the habit of typing cs50.dev, enter, and you've probably noticed, if not prior to today, after today, that the full URL ends up being https://cs50.dev, that the full URL ends up being https://cs50.dev/, and then maybe some other stuff after that. But implicit in that URL is one of those port numbers that we saw in TCP, either 80 or 443. Because it's HTTPS, it's actually the latter, 443, which indicates implicitly that there must be a server on cs50.dev that is listening for requests and is serving up that version of VS Code. In fact, implicitly that there must be a server on cs50.dev that is listening for requests and is serving up that.
Jadi ada server di that listening for requests.
That version of VS Code. In fact, we eventually redirect you to GitHub's version of VS Code, aka code spaces, but the idea is the same. And in that URL, you have a web page that's being served up to you, but it's already running on port 443 and perhaps 80. Which is to say, if we want to come up with our own web server, we could like start up our own server, connect it to the internet, give it an IP already running on port 443 and perhaps 80. Which is to say, if we want to come up with our own web server, we could like start up our own server, connect it to the internet, give it an IP address, and then communicate with it using port 80 or 443. But it's actually a lot simpler to embrace the reality that any server can have multiple services, be it web or email or video conferencing or the like, or heck, 2 different web servers. And so even though VS Code in the cloud is already running a web server, because that's indeed how it works, there's nothing stopping you and me from inside of VS Code starting a second web server, so long as we choose a different port number, a different TCP port that's not already being used by the server itself. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to introduce you to a new command today, called quite appropriately http-server. This is a command that you can run in your terminal window that will start your very own web server by default on port 8080. 8080 isn't that special, but it tends to be a convention. Whenever you want to run a web server on a port other than 80 by default, you would just use 8080.
8080 should go.
Command that you can run in your terminal window that will start your very own web server by default on port 8080. 8080 isn't that special, but it tends to be a convention. Whenever you want to run a web server on a port other than 80 by default, you would just use 8080 as a go-to. But it could really be any number within a large server not already being used by the server itself. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to introduce you to a new command today called quite appropriately HTTP.
Quite appropriately HTTP server. Okay. Yan na ba pida? Dumungan na. Pangalan niya ito. Oh. Pagkakanda kita. Ikawan kau asli na. Oy. Bentar na. Sir.
Introduce you to a new command today called quite appropriately HTTP-server. This is a command that you can run in your terminal window that will start your very own web server by default on port 8080. 8080 isn't that special, but it tends to be a convention. Whenever you want to run a web server on a port other than 80 by default, you would just use 8080 as a go-to. 8080. 8080 isn't that special, but it tends to be a convention. Whenever you want to run a web server on a port other than 80 by default, you would just use 8080 as a go-to. But it could really be any number within a large range. Now, this HTTP server command is going to allow me to serve up some actual content. What might that content be? Well, let me go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and run code index.html, and let me go ahead and whip up a very simple web page herein. And I'll explain in just a moment what these lines are, but let me go ahead and just kind of transcribe it in this here file. So angle bracket, exclamation point, doc type, HTML, close bracket. Then I had HTML lang equals quote unquote en. Then I had head. Then I had title, and inside of that title I had hello, comma, title. Below that head I had open tag body, inside of which I had hello body. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on here if you've never seen this before, but I think I have recreated the file you just saw in slide form a moment ago. What I'm now going to do is try to view this file inside of my browser, but to do that I need to do this. I'm going to go ahead and run HTTP server, enter, and a whole bunch of stuff is going to appear in my terminal window, some diagnostic output, a URL, and the like. But in particular, I'm going to get this little pop-up that's telling me, oh, my application running on port 8080 is now available. This is just a user-friendly feature of VS Code, specifically CS50's own extension therein, that allows me to click Open in Browser. I immediately get a second tab inside of which I see the contents of my code space at this moment in time. Now notice, to save myself some time today, I've downloaded in advance a source 8 folder inside of which are a lot of today's examples if I so need them. And there's a file I literally just created called index.html. What you're seeing here is a directory index of my current folder. So this is a dynamically, automatically generated web page that's simply showing me in a web browser what is inside of my code space. Now, what's my URL? Well, it turns out it's going to be something that ends in github.dev, which is a domain that GitHub itself controls. So that's going to be generated for me automatically. It's not a domain name I had to buy or sign up for, and it's really meant to be temporary because I'm going to use my code space as a development environment to develop web pages. But most important for now is that indeed this server program is running on localhost, which is a nickname for the local computer, no matter what its actual name is, specifically on port 8080. And this is why I'm now seeing my folder instead of VS Code. This tab has port 8080. This tab would appear to have port 443, which is GitHub's own web server running at this domain. Now I'm going to go ahead and click my index.html, and we will see what the simplest web page in the world might look like. And voila, there is my hello body, which is the only thing in this otherwise big white rectangular region, otherwise known as the viewport of my browser. And if I zoom in at the top here, you'll see that my title of my tab is indeed what we saw earlier, hello, comma, title. So long story short, even if you're completely new to developing web pages, clearly we have the ability with this language called HTML to indicate what the title of a page should be in its tab and what the contents of its body should be, as underwhelming and as black and white as all of this might be. Well, let me go back to my sample code here, and let's now actually...
Nah, sekarang aku pengen coba deh. Oke. Saatnya coba dong. Gimana diem aja sih? Oke. Sekarang web ya. Ya, just call it web. Short. Loading. Reload window. Bentar, reload. Habis kan baterainya? Sekarang. Nah, itu dia. Directory bisa also apa? Web. Nah, sini bisa langsung apa? Web. Masuk ke sana. Kok biasa oh iya, terus getir testing. Oke, sekarang kita masuk ke yang testing ya. Nah, untuk yang di testing ini aku bikin text.html. Oke. Ready? Dokumen type ya, type HTML. Yep, tapi enggak gede sih. HTML dia pakai beberapa juga ya. Kok gak ini aja? Ya, bahasa Inggris aja. Sorry, ya. Title. Apa harus gitu ya? kita ini. Lalu di sini ada namanya body. Coba sekarang http ya dot server. Buat browser. Ya ini pada jadi hello Ryan, tutup sampai kembali.
Introduce some building blocks herein. So what is actually going on? The first line of code that I typed, that you see highlighted here, is the page's so-called document type declaration. That's a silly mouthful, but it's really just a standardized line of text that says, hey browser, here comes a web page written in HTML. Specifically version 5 of HTML, which is what most of the world is now using. Odds are this line of code will change over time, but for now this is what we have. Below that, things get a little more interesting and a little more symmetric, if you will, and no more exclamation points like you see in this first line. That's a bit of an anomaly. Down here, you'll see what I'll describe as open bracket, HTML, then the space, then lang equals quote unquote en, then close bracket. And by open and close bracket, I mean a less than sign and a greater than sign, respectively, which you can type on your keyboard. What this is doing is the following. This is the beginning of an HTML element, as we might call it, and the tag here for this element is called HTML. So anything immediately after a less than sign is the name of the tag. And the way that browsers work
streaming aja. Makan. Man, just buka streaming aja, buka lagi tuh. Gue cukup gak sih? Ya, soalnya bisa begini.
Is by relying is the name of the tag. And the way that browsers work is by relying on these tags to know what to do and where within the confines of the browser. So you can think of this first tag as saying, hey browser, here comes some HTML. Now what is that HTML all about? Well, this thing here highlighted, lang, short for language, indicates what human language is presumably going to be used throughout the rest of the page. All of the tags, all of the attributes, for better or for worse, are going to be in English because the language HTML itself was standardized by English-speaking people. You can write web pages with your own content in any human language. In this case, I have opted to write my page, as simple as it is, in English as well. Hello title and hello body. And the en attribute value here, so to speak, is just like a clue to the browser that in case you've got Google Translate or any kind of automatic translation, this is a little hint as to what the human language is to facilitate automatic translation or search engine optimization, SEO, or the like. But that whole thing started the HTML page. Now we have a sequence of other tags. Hey browser, here comes the head of the page, which metaphorically is like the very top of the page here, aka the tab that we looked at a moment ago. Hey browser, here comes the title of my page. What's the title? The title is hello, comma, title. Now things are a little weird. The next line of text here is open bracket / title close bracket. And whereas therefore I might call the previous tag the open tag or the start tag, this one here now would be the close tag or the end tag. So there's a symmetry here that effectively is conveying to the browser, hey browser, that's it for the title. The title is now complete. What comes next? Hey browser, that's it for the head of the web page. Nothing left in there. What comes next? Hey browser, here comes the body of the web page, sort of everything else. The big contents of that white rectangular region is the so-called body of the page. Hey browser, here's the contents of the body. Hey browser, that's it for the body. Hey browser, that's it for the HTML itself. Now notice the / indicates the end tag or the close tag, and you don't need to be super verbose. Even though my HTML tag started with a language attribute, lang equals quote unquote en, you don't need to repeat the lang, you don't need to repeat the quotes or the en. It's sort of obvious to the browser that this is closing the previously opened HTML tag. Now, in general, the tags you're seeing should exist in one and only one place. You must use these tags in certain locations. We will soon see bunches of other tags that you can use 0 or more times to structure the actual contents of your own page. So how do we get into that, and what are we ultimately doing? Well, what we really have is, in this HTML code, a textual representation of a tree. One of our now familiar data structures, whereby there's a root of this tree that has some number of children, that might have some number of grandchildren, and so forth. And so depicted here at right is what you might call a document object model, or DOM, D-O-M for short, which is actually what the browser is probably doing in its own memory, or RAM, when it accesses a web page. In other words, if you type in google.com and hit enter, you immediately see the contents of Google's website in your browser. What Google has probably done is sent text that looks kind of like this, but more complicated than this simple example. That text is read top to bottom, left to right by your browser and loaded somehow into memory using malloc or other techniques like that to create bunches of nodes in memory with a lot of pointers that somehow represent this tree structure in the computer's memory so that it actually knows what to display on the screen. So with that said, let me go back here to VS Code, and I'm going to go do a sequence of examples now, and I'm going to go back to the code and then back to my browser to show you exactly what's going on. Recall that at this moment in time, the only two things I have are a source 8 folder, which I came with by default today in advance in case I need to copy paste anything, and index.html, which I just created for the first time. So let me go back to my VS Code tab here, and you'll notice that in my terminal window, there's actually a bunch of logging information, diagnostic information. Long story short, anytime anyone visits a web server with a browser, odds are the server is logging. Anytime anyone visits a web server.
Here, together, outbound Windows dan Mozilla. Oke. Sampai 32. Lanjut.
VS Code tab here, and you'll notice that in my terminal window, there's actually a bunch of logging information, diagnostic information. Long story short, anytime anyone visits a web server with a browser, odds are the server is logging that visit. In fact, this is how companies know.
Oke. Oh ya, halo, selamat datang. Member baru, selamat datang di stream. Ini konteksnya aku mau belajar HTML, CSS, JavaScript nih. Oke, lanjut.
This is how internet service providers know. This is how parental controls know what websites you are visiting, because all of this information is going back and forth between browser and server. Here, because I am running the server via that HTTP server command, I now get access to all of this juicy information, including what the browser is that the user is using, what day and time they visited my page, and so forth. But for the sake of discussion, I'm not going to really care about this diagnostic information. I'm going to hide this for the most part. But notice too under ports now, whereas previously I only had one TCP port in use, 1337, which is CS50 specific. Now notice that VS Code has detected that I'm running something else on port 8080. So you see a second port there, and you might, over time, if you open more and more tabs, see even additional.
Berarti satu server itu bisa lebih dari satu port ya katanya ya. Selama portnya nggak sama, bisa. Yeah, bener ya.
Ports as well that all happen for you automatically. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and hide my terminal window because I don't really care what's going on there, but that's still going to keep HTTP server for me running in the background. Let's go ahead and introduce some new tags. So for instance, let me go ahead and create a new file. Actually, let me retract that. Let me open my terminal window, and instead of showing the log, let me create a second terminal window with the plus icon. So I'm still running the other one with the command, but I still have the ability to run commands now in my here prompt. For instance, I want to run a command, code paragraphs.html. Let's go ahead and create a more interesting web page with actual paragraphs of English or other type of text. To save myself some keystrokes, I'm going to be in the habit today of copying the hello world example as a starting point perhaps, and then just changing it as needed. For instance, I'm going to change the title of this here page to paragraphs, and then in here, I'm going to type out some paragraphs of text. Now, what are those paragraphs? Well, I wanted to save some time, so in advance, I generated some Latin-like text here, so I can copy-paste 3 long paragraphs of Latin text, some lorem ipsum text here. Now, it doesn't matter what this means. It's sort of nonsensical words, but this is a web page that is going to have ultimately some paragraphs of text. Not English, but fake Latin. So let's go ahead and open this. Let me go back to my other tab. I do need to reload this tab because I've created a new file that this browser didn't know about before. There it is, paragraphs.html. Let me go ahead and click now, paragraphs.html, and voila. There are my 3 paragraphs. Well, wait a minute. This is just like one big blob of...
Saya coba ya. Oke, jadi untuk ini last line code nah bisa nggak? Kak. Oke, seperti biasa, lalu ini kan copy paragraf. Kalau yang ini yang jadi paragraphs. Nah, buat bikin channelnya ini, pengennya ke paragraf generate. Oke, copy masuk ke sini. Nah, ini kan awalnya mintanya gini, cuma pas di sananya atau di ininya ini kalau di putar nih harusnya berubah itu. Oke, HTTP server. Oke, udah di-run ya. Wih, apa wah ini wah? Bukan lah. Masuk sini aja. Move. Nah, saya Control C. Bentar. Hit Control C to stop server. Oke. Oh lupa, ini nggak masuk ke sana. Kalau terminal baru itu ya, dia nggak nge-save memori yang sebelumnya ya, disk yang sebelumnya ya. Oke. Ini CD-nya banyak ini. CD bisa 08 web sama dengan testing. Nah, di sini baru HTTP server. Nah, sekarang bisa. Nah, tapi masalahnya dia tuh kayak gini. Nah, caranya kita dengan menggunakan P. Rambut dulu sih. P. Nah, sekarang kalau dilakuin harusnya berubah. Nah, jadi kayak gini. Tapi bentar, ada yang salah deh. Kata aja. Makanya dia tuh di depan sendiri gitu. Di sini. Ini banyak kali ini. Oke, otomatis ya. Nah, jadi kayak gini nih, 3.
Of a paragraph instead of the 3 paragraphs that I was promised. Well, why is that? Well, let me go back to my editor here, and you'll see that even if I hide my terminal here, even though I've got these blank lines, clearly the browser is just ignoring me. And this is because HTML is pretty pedantic. Like, it is designed to only do what you tell it to do. And so if you don't tell it explicitly, give me a new paragraph, it's just going to combine adjacent texts, as we've seen already. So how do I do this? It's actually pretty simple. Let me go into my body tag, and let me actually open a paragraph tag, or P for short. Now notice VS Code is trying to be helpful by automatically completing the rest of this thought by giving me both a start tag and an end tag. In this case, that's not really helpful because I already have the text that I want to put inside of this paragraph. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the close tag manually, and I'm going to move over here and close this myself. And just to be stylistically nice, I'm going to go ahead and indent that. Now down here, I'm going to do one more paragraph tag, P for short. I'm going to cut that out, and I'm going to paste this in here. And again, I'm fighting with the auto formatting because it is trying to understand what I intend, even though I'm going back and fixing this now. Let me fix that. Let me go down here. Let me go ahead and fix this now. Indent here, and voila. Now we've got 3 paragraph elements. And to be clear, an HTML element is generally everything between a start tag and an end tag. So I have 3 paragraph elements, P for short. Why is it only P? Well, the designers of the HTML language years ago decided, why write out paragraphs when open bracket P, close?
Oke. Kita pengennya lebih kayak simple gitu. Apa ikut itu aja lah, ikut profnya aja lah. Oke, bentar. Iya, di sini dia bilangnya kayak gini ya. Kayak gini. Ini. Ya bener sih, begini sih. Ya oke lah, kita ikutin aja lah ya, dari senseinya aja lah.
Close bracket minor tag. So I have 3 paragraph elements, P for short. Why is it only P? Well, the designers of the HTML language years ago decided why write out paragraphs when open bracket P, close bracket suffices. So let's now go back to my other tab. If I now, I see nothing changed, but again, that's because I already received the virtual envelope in my browser that contained the previous version of that page. If I want to get a new copy of paragraphs.html, I need to reload this tab, and now I see the same text, but broken down into 3 separate paragraphs. So this is just to demonstrate the point that if you want something to happen, you really need to tell the browser to do exactly that. Well, let's introduce some other tags too. Let me go back to my editor here. Let me go ahead and open my terminal window, and let's create something called headings.html. Okay. Much like a book, much like an academic paper, you might have section headings, like the chapter and the section and the subsection and so forth. We can actually implement this with some HTML too. So let me kind of cut a corner here and copy and paste paragraphs.html into headings.html. Let me hide my terminal window. Let me change the title here just to be headings, to be super explicit as to what's going on. And let me go ahead now and say H1, 1. And down here, let me say H2, 2. And down here, let me say H3, 3. Now, these are 3 new tags, H1, H2, and H3. By definition, H1 is typically big and bold. H2 is typically not quite as big, but still bold. H3 is not quite as big still, but still bold. And these are the default stylizations of these here tags that come with HTML. Let me go back to my other tab. Let me click back, so I now see my new file, headings.html. Let me click on headings.html, and now, even though it's still nonsensical Latin-like text, at least it's starting to look pretty. Looks like a chapter of a book with some sections and subsections and so forth. That's because the browser now understands what it is I want of it. Now, you could simulate this by just literally typing the word 1 in its own paragraph, the word 2 in its own paragraph, the word 3 in its own paragraph, but it wouldn't be bigger and it wouldn't be bolder. And when it comes to the semantics of web pages, it's probably useful to use tags, in this case, like H1, H2, H3, because it kind of indicates the relative importance of the text. Like this is the beginning of the text, this is maybe some finer detail, and then this is the finest detail. It might actually help search engines, or heck, even AI nowadays, understand that these are different sections in your text. And we'll soon see there's even other tags you can do to be even more helpful to the browser and search engines and AI. Well, how about something else? Let's move away from big blobs of...
Nah, ini setahu ya, untuk text header itu dia ada ya benar kayak hierarchy, ada hierarchy-nya. Jadi aku pengen want to add something in HTML text for header. How many kinds of it there are? Six kinds. Jadi ada dari H1 sampai H6 ya. Oke. H1 itu yang paling besar sampai H6. Oke. Per page. One is typically used one per page for the main title. The rest is to create a structured hierarchy like chapters and subchapters in a book. Okay, lanjut.
Nonsense and search engines and AI. Well, how about something else? Let's move away from big blobs of nonsensical text, and let's do something with a chunk of nonsensical lists. Let me go into my terminal window, create a new file called list.html, and let me copy paste my hello code from earlier just to save some steps. And let me go ahead and rename the title to list in this case. And let's just have a list of 3 things. Foo.
Oh ya, lupa. Aku belum nyoba. Biasakan kalau mau ini nih ditulis ya. What is headers? Header. HTML ntar jangan gak bisa lah, terus ini baru ya. Nggak usah sih, yang gini aja, daripada repot-repot. Nah gini aja, code header.html. Oke, buat header ini pakai yang ini ya, tadi copy paste. Nah di sini itu dikasih header. Nah ya kalau mau belajar itu harus dipraktekin ya, biar ada masalah memorinya. Ini H2, ini H3, 3. Sekarang kita coba di http server. Ini bisa sih langsung. Nah, kalau lihat di sini nanti dia harusnya udah berubah. Nah ini ada di header. Nah ini cuma ada yang lupa, paragrafnya belum ku ganti. Jadi header ini. Nah tadi headers udah ini di stop bentar. Lanjut ke yang tadi list ya. Sebentar, code collect code list.html. Oke, yang ada di index html di pusatnya sana sini, terus kita sisanya lanjut seperti ini kan.
Bar title to list in this case, and let's just have a list of 3 things: foo, bar, and baz. If you've never heard these words before, they're sort of go-to computer science words when you just want some random placeholders. They mean nothing per se, but foo, bar, and baz are go-to default words like X, Y, and Z for mathematicians. All right, this looks like a nice, pretty list. I've indented it, which looks great, but if I go back to my other tab, hit back, and I click on list.html, I think you probably know where this is going. Just like the paragraphs, we just get one big paragraph of foo, bar, baz. We don't get foo on one line, bar on the next line, baz on the third. Well, why is that? Well, just as before, the browser seems to be ignoring white space beyond single white spaces. In fact, I can try to be really explicit, like, please give me some breaks between these lines. But if I go back to my other tab, click reload, it just canonicalizes multiple spaces into a single space, for better or for worse. So if I really want a list, I need to tell the browser that I want a list. And one way I can do that is as follows. Let me delete that temporarily, and let me do UL for unordered list, which means I'm going to get a bulleted list with little circles next to each word.
Ya. Aku mulai mengingat kembali pelajaran dulu ini. Oke, header. Lalu ada UL. Ini UL, it stands for unordered list.
Let me then use an li tag for list item and type foo inside of the first. Let me type another li tag and bar for the next one, and then a third with baz. And again, VS Code is auto-completing, which is why I'm able to type the close tag so quickly. But I've got now foo, bar, and baz inside of li tags, which in turn are inside of a ul tag. Now, let me go back to my other tab, click reload, and now we have a bulleted list of items, one at a time. Well, what if I want to number this list? Well, I could certainly just go in here and start manually writing 1 and 2 and 3, but you could imagine that getting a little annoying over time, because if you need to reorder the list or add things to it, like, it's just minorly annoying to have to maintain numbers for lists of things. Like, this is what software is good at. This is an easy fix, and you might guess where I'm going with this, if I want to move from an unordered list, which is just bullets by default, to an ordered list, which is numbered, I can change the UL to an OL in both places so that my start tag and end tag still match. I can go back to my other tab, click reload, and what's going to happen by default now is, I get 1 and 2 and 3. And long story short, there are actually techniques whereby you can change this behavior using attributes to not just be these Arabic numerals, but you can use Roman numerals or other symbols that browsers are designed to support, and it all just kind of happens for you, which is great because if you're writing something like an outline for a paper or the like, you don't really want to have to think about all of those numbers, just like Google Docs and Microsoft Word. Like, the software should figure that out for you. And indeed, HTML can do just that. All right, how about one other here? This time, let me go ahead and cut a corner and open a file I created in advance just to save a few keystrokes. Let me close most of those files for now.
Nah, kita coba mengerjakannya ya. List, I'll call it like list. Okay, and now yang ada bus. Tapi ini aku mau bikinnya itu yang itu apa namanya? Yang unordered list. Ini otomatis nanti. Ini LI tulis item. LI bus. Nah, ini kalau yang oh ya, apa? Benar. Nah, kepin yang itu yang unordered dulu, yang berantakan dulu, yang nggak ada urutannya. Unordered list. Not the last list. Nah, baru dari sini akan ke mungkin ya. Lalu ini yang ordered list. Nah, kalau buat isinya sih ya sama aja sih sebenarnya. Nah, ini cuma ganti OL. Nah, kalau kita lihat di sini, kali ini kalau kita masuk ke HTTP servernya, kita lihat Oke Nusan. Oke, halo Oke Nusan. Ya, semangat juga. Sebentar. Ngelag nih. Ini ya. Ini ya. http.server. Nah, sekarang kalau kita lihat di sini seharusnya bisa.